Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this lunchtime conference on launch of the global action to prevent and address trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants. So, thank you for coming to the external info point for this new year after the big success of the European Year for Development. So we continue with our lunchtime conference, and the mission of the info point remains the same. So it's improve the understanding of the visibility and development cooperation policies. We continue to organize lunchtime conference like this one. So if you have some projects financed by DASCO, please contact the unit in charge of this project to organize a lunchtime conference for you. We organize as well the special visit for the special group like students. So if you know some student interested in development cooperation policies, we can contact us, Francesca and Alessandro, to organize a visit for them. I would like to inform you that this lunchtime conference we will be web streaming. We can find the link in the Europe website, and the conference, the web stream stay for some weeks after the conference, after today. So now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Stefano Signore, Head of Unit DASCO B3, Employment, Social Inclusion and Migration. Thank you, enjoy the conference.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. By the way, since the Commission would like to change title of the unit, so this was changed also recently, which is now Migration, Employment, Inequalities, but this is just for the update, let's say. So thank you very much. I see that we have managed to gather quite a big attendance today, which also shows the interest and the relevance of the topic in the policy debate. I don't plan to speak long because we have four important persons who are going to take the floor, so I don't wish to take any from their time. By the way, John even traveled from Vienna to Brussels, so I will simply say that we are happy to be there today to launch this global action 2015-2019 to prevent and address trafficking in person and smuggling of migrants. Both trafficking human beings and smuggling have become very topical in the debate about migration governance. They are very cross-sectorial and multidimensional issues which touch upon human rights, border management, protection issues, assistance to vulnerable migrants, police cooperation, exchange of information, fight against organized crime, and so on. So very complex issues where, by definition, we need the involvement of all the different actors having experience, knowledge, working in the different areas, and making sure that contribution of each of those can be put together in order to achieve results. Of course, this we are not doing alone. We are doing a lot with partner countries, with authority in our partner countries. We can make example about, for instance, the recent Valletta process with a number of African countries, but also under the so-called Rabat and Khartoum processes, or the Silk Route with a number of Asian countries, or just to mention, for instance, also the Budapest or the Prague process. I wish to introduce a little bit the speakers. We have Miriam Vassiliadou. She's a friend and also an excellent colleague. So she's the anti-trafficking coordinator, established in the IOM, but dealing with anti-trafficking issues and coordinating those overall the Commission and also the EU institution. We have John Brandolino from UNODC, so our main partner in this project, Director for United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We have Jenny Ambrosi, another important partner in our Brussels life on migration-related issues, and we have shared important things, including nights, sleepless nights in senior official meetings in recent times. And Verena Knaus from UNICEF. I have to say we are happy to see different actors working together, not only in the institutions as Miria and I, but actors like UNODC, IOM, UNICEF working together on the same project. So I would stop there and leave the floor to Miria, please.
Okay, maybe you can, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to address the event today, and thank you to Stefano, of course, who is behind coordinating all this work we do all the time in a tireless way. I'm particularly content to be here because we hope that this project will contribute to the implementation of the EU strategy towards the eradication of trafficking human beings. Of course, in cooperation with the UNODC, with the IOM and UNICEF, long-standing, trustworthy partners in our joint efforts to address trafficking. And we all know, and it's clear, but I think sometimes we need to remember the EU legal framework, and we need to remember what we're here to discuss. Trafficking is about selling and buying people. It's about selling and buying women, men, girls, and boys. And it is abusing people as commodities. And we can expect that today, with the migration and the refugee crisis, more people are becoming vulnerable. In fact, we know they're becoming vulnerable to traffickers. So the project is very timely. And I cannot insist enough that we need to focus on victims and ensure they have access to assistance, to protection, and to support. We also see this action, this joint project, within the context of the Valletta Summit on migration. During the summit, the EU and the member states, political leaders committed to scale up joint efforts in eradicating trafficking and combat those who exploit vulnerable people. The action plan that was adopted includes the prevention and the fight against irregular migration, migrant smuggling, and trafficking in human beings as one of 5 priorities. The political leaders have committed to provide protection, assistance, and support to victims of trafficking, with special attention to the most vulnerable groups, including children and including women, and to support establishing standard operating procedures for the referral of victims of trafficking at the national and the cross-border level. So I'm content that this project will address these elements. What we need, of course, is concrete results. What we need is a difference to people's lives, to victims' lives. I'm proud to say that amidst all these terrible times and discourse that is taking place at the time, we have continued to promote globally high standards in addressing trafficking, in line with the comprehensive anti-trafficking policy and legal framework. I need to remind you that the EU remains one of the world's largest aid donors, and I'm pleased to see that our strategic cooperation with the UNODC, with the IOM, with UNICEF continues now with this €10 million project, which also complements an ongoing $10.5 million project jointly implemented with the Red Cross and targeting civil society. And we look forward to continuing this cooperation and concrete results. Let me also remind you a little bit in terms of coordination and how we ensure that trafficking is appropriately placed in different policy dialogues and policy frameworks happening at the EU level. Trafficking is now incorporated in the European migration agenda, in the European security agenda, in the framework of its human rights dialogue with over 40 countries across the world. It's an important component in the adopted action plan on human rights and democracy in relation to third countries for the next period. Also, very recently, the European Commission and the External Action Service adopted a new framework for the EU activities on gender equality and women's empowerment in EU's external relations. So, of course, it is a very complex phenomenon, and we're trying to deal with it using different policy strands, different policy areas, and a multiplicity of stakeholders and actors. I was at another event this morning discussing the need to identify victims and the need to ensure and foremost their fundamental rights. And I want us to remember time and time again, when we talk about trafficking, we can say anything we like, but first and foremost, it's a fundamental human rights violation. It is the only form of organized crime that is clearly stipulated in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So I see the role of this project, I see the role of the Commission, I see our role as upholding these fundamental rights of the victims. I also want to put a little bit of a context. I won't say too much about the data, but the Eurostat data, the latest we have for up to the period of 2012, is clear on trends. It might not be 100% there, but we're working towards better and better data collection, and the trends are also very consistent with UNODC data that we have available. First of all, 69% of the victims are victims of trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, the ones identified in the EU. 19% of the victims are victims for trafficking for labor exploitation. 80% of the victims are female. Let us not say that this is not a gendered phenomenon or ignore the gender dimension of this. 1,000 child victims were trafficked for sexual exploitation in the period from 2010 to 2012. The invisible children, including in today's crisis, and that we need to ensure that they're made more visible and that we put a centerpiece of the work that we do on this. And I'm glad that UNICEF is with us in this effort. And the last thing I want to say on data is that 65% of the victims of trafficking are EU nationals, the ones identified. 2/3 of the victims identified, as well as 2/3 of the traffickers, are EU nationals. This means we need to equally pay attention to all victims, irrespective of status. Right now, I will concentrate more on the links between smuggling and trafficking and third country nationals, but we need to also put this context there. In terms of, okay, I'll skip some of the, okay. And at the same time, we talk about fundamental rights, but let us not forget that trafficking is also a severe form of organized criminality. So yes, it is stipulated in the Charter, but it is extremely profitable form of crime. In fact, the ILO tells us that forced labor more broadly is worth $150 billion annually only for the traffickers. Let's remember also the legal sectors engaged in illegal business. Let us remember the legal sectors engaged in legal business, and then you know the amounts of money we're talking about. What we need is to cooperate. We need to cooperate at the national level, at the regional level, at the European level, at the international level. External cooperation is fundamental, and indeed, in the area of trafficking, we've been working on this from back in 2009 with the action-oriented paper under the Swedish presidency to strengthen the external dimension against trafficking. Together with the Council and in very good cooperation with our colleagues from DEFCO, from the External Action Service, ECHO, and other services, we have established a list of priority countries and regions for cooperation in addressing trafficking. But it's not only in terms of who cooperates with who in terms of geography, but also in terms of policy. We need to work with the police, with judicial cooperation, protection of human rights, external relations, migration policies, social labor law. And I'm proud to say that in the area of trafficking and using the EU strategy, we have been doing that since 2012 when we launched the strategy. It's encouraging to see that the project aims to provide protection, assistance, and support to victims. In fact, it's not just encouraging. Actually, member states have an obligation to do so. I won't list all the articles in the EU directive, but the obligation is loud and clear. I also want to say that when it comes to victims, I think we need to be stronger in the language we use. A lot of people I heard around, and I said again this morning, apologies to Eugenius who was there this morning to hear it again, but we often talk about victims, we say trafficked persons. Of course they're trafficked persons. Of course they're persons. Of course they have agency. But they also have rights. And they're clearly stipulated in different EU legal instruments. In fact, we have summarized those in a list of victims' rights, summarizing 17 pieces of EU law available in 23 languages in a very accessible manner. And I think we need to remember that these are the people we're here to serve in the area of trafficking. We also need to remember that the EU, as part of its, as the largest donor on these issues, has funded over 100 projects with a primary component, human trafficking, in the last period. For this reason, we have launched a study as a deliverable of the strategy that will deliver a comprehensive policy review of the projects funded since 2003, to map the geographical areas, the fields, the different actors, the types of projects, and an analysis of the outcomes of these projects and recommendations. And why are we doing that? The EU strategy incorporated work from 8 DGs, 8 services of the Commission, 8 EU agencies, member states, civil society, and the private sector. We have funded projects across the field in about 11 different DGs. What we need to do now is launch the new agenda on trafficking at the end of 2016, with the end of the current policy framework. And to do that, we wanted to see where we are at the moment. We need a transparent process where we understand what have we funded, what have we done, what have we achieved, have we achieved anything, what has the impact been, and how can this feed into the next policy period. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the objectives of the projects is to help countries efficiently address the issue of trafficking and smuggling and the interlinkages between them. We know that trafficking and smuggling are illegal businesses. We know they are often perpetrated by criminal networks who profit from the extreme vulnerabilities of people. The organizers of smuggling benefit from the migrants' irregular crossing, and traffickers aim to exploit trafficked persons. And if we really seriously want to help all the vulnerable people involved in these processes, we need conceptual clarity. We need to understand that we are speaking about different legal instruments and legal phenomena that often have very, very strong links. The international and EU law clearly stipulate the main differentiating factors between the two, as these relate to consent, to borders, to state responsibility. Let us not forget that when we talk about smuggling, I'm speaking legally now, we are referring to a crime against the state. When we talk about trafficking, we are referring to a crime against the individual. So the responsibilities of the state are different in the two. But we also know, of course, that the links are incredibly close, especially in today's crisis. The challenges we're currently confronted indicate, for example, that asylum procedures can and are used or misused as pull factors by traffickers with serious and detrimental consequences for the victims. They also indicate that smuggling can and does lead into trafficking once in the EU. Children are the most vulnerable. I do hope that Verena will say a lot more about this. At the same time, the boats bringing people in the EU can and are used by traffickers who recruit their victims in the countries of origin. Children are forced onto boats to become trafficked once, for sexual exploitation once in EU soil. We also have indications of the need to ensure better identification of victims and proper implementation of the relevant legislation. We cannot afford to let victims of trafficking undetected. At the moment, it's an extremely big challenge and one we have to confront. Allow me, it's not a bracket, but I want to highlight something here. I want to highlight that trafficking doesn't happen because of the victims. I say time and time and time again until it's heard from the Commission point of view. Victims don't cause trafficking. Vulnerability doesn't cause trafficking. Money does. This morning I heard a prosecutor from our member state saying that if you take away the money from the trafficking process, you have horrible things, of course, that we know of, but you don't have trafficking. The profits are huge, they're immense. I think if we ignore those profits, if we fail to address that, if we fail to address and follow the money to ensure that we have thorough, proactive financial investigations, thorough prosecutions and thorough convictions, and serious convictions, I don't think we will get anywhere. So trafficking happens predominantly because of the money. And money also fuels demand, and that's the other reason behind trafficking. I said before that we have children on boats coming on European soil, thousands of them, to be trafficked for sexual exploitation once in Europe. And yes, they are the children. and there are victims, and all that we know, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're counting on this project. But who's using their services? Behind every victim, for all forms of exploitation, there is someone using a service, someone buying goods, someone exploiting the victim. So for the Commission, trafficking is about ensuring that we follow the money. If we stop the money flow, we stop the trafficking. It's as simple as that, and I'm sure the UNODC will testify to the organized criminality of this challenge. And then the demand. If we fail to address the demand, I don't know how we can address the issue. And I'm not saying that because I'm just a strong believer in the issue. I'm saying that because the EU directive is very clear. The member states are obliged to take action to reduce demand that fosters all forms of exploitation. What does that mean? It means they are obliged to take action. They are obliged to train frontline officials, including judges and prosecutors. They are obliged to create awareness. They are obliged to consider criminalizing those who knowingly make use of the services of victims. In fact, on the last thing, I want to also say that we will be launching a report. We will be having a report at the end of the year as part of the directive, again, on the criminalization of those who knowingly make use of the services of victims. We are unaware of another area of crime in the world where someone, a Eurocrime in the treaty, not a little thing, it's not petty theft, it's a Eurocrime, where someone is knowingly involved in the crime and in half of our member states not criminalized. Let me turn on to smuggling for a very few minutes, if you allow me, if you can bear with me. Migrant smuggling is a very fast-growing criminal activity. Long-standing situations of instability, political, socio-economic crisis that we all know in third countries, including in the EU's very neighborhood, are pushing increasing numbers of people to require smugglers' services to flee their countries. More than over 1.5 million irregular border crossings at EU external borders have been detected from January to November 2015. Compared to roughly 250,000 in the same period the previous year. That's around 500% increase according to Frontex. However, it should be stressed that irregular border crossings may be attempted by the same person several times in different locations at the external borders. This means that a large number of people who were counted when they arrived in Greece were again counted when entering the EU for the second time through Hungary or Croatia. The wide majority of irregular migrants and asylum seekers trying to reach the EU via sea, land, air, use the services of criminals who take advantage of their desperation. They put their lives at risk. Facilitation of irregular migration and stay in the EU involves many countries of transit and origin along different air, land, and sea routes. It can take various forms, from the actual transportation or management of transportation of any person lacking a right to enter a country of which he or she is not a national, to provision and production of fraudulent documents, the organization of sham marriages, or other means to facilitate unauthorized entry. Today, migrant smuggling to the EU is also increasingly related to human rights violations and even death, and of course relates to trafficking. Migrants who have been the subject of an action to facilitate irregular migration are often being abused, exploited during, after they reach the EU. They offer accommodation to them under exploitative conditions, particularly when lawful renting is not allowed. In 2014, over 3,000 migrants are estimated to have lost their lives in the Mediterranean. In 2015, this number has further raised, with more than 3,770 of migrants found dead or missing. This is data from the IOM. The EU has not been idle in the face of constant strategies. The prevention and fight against migrant smuggling was set as a key priority, and of course it is addressed equally in the migration and security agendas adopted earlier this year. We also had the European Action Plan Against Migrant Smuggling in May 2015 that testifies to the strong commitment to prevent and repress migrant smuggling. The action plan endorses closer cooperation between the EU and relevant stakeholders on the fight against migrant smuggling, including international organizations and third countries. The UNODC is one of our strategic partners to push forward actions in the field. Just like for trafficking in human beings, the UNODC mandate and expertise in monitoring the protocols to the Palermo Convention are essential for disrupting the activities of smugglers. The EU is not only a party to the UN protocol against the smuggling of migrants, like all its member states, and therefore bound to respect and implement its provisions. So by supporting the UNODC in this project, the EU is also supporting third countries to implement the protocol, improving their capacity to address the crimes, paving their way to closer, more effective cooperation. We need an all-inclusive, widespread provision of capacity building to third countries. And this is also signaled by the EU Action Plan on Smuggling, on migrant smuggling, as one of its objectives. I want to close. We are facing incredibly crucial, challenging, difficult times. We have a number of shared priorities. Migrant smuggling is a multidimensional form of crime at the juncture of migration, security, humanitarian and foreign policies. No actor can be spared to work on this issue. Third countries, EU and international organizations gathered at the Valletta Summit 2 months ago have recognized this. We need a coordinated approach. I dare say that on trafficking, we are quite well on the way with the current strategy, and already for a number of years, we have been using this coordinated approach, I think with fruitful results. I invite you to check everything we have done on the trafficking side on our dedicated website. We have a midterm report with everything we have delivered. In fact, I know I'm speaking on behalf of the Commission, but I can say we delivered everything we promised in the strategy up to the point of the midterm report. I think you will find. And what we're doing now is that we're presenting the first report on progress made in addressing trafficking as per Article 20 of the directive. This will come out in 2 months. It's the first report at the EU level. The member states have all contributed, and so have 95 NGOs. I think this is fundamental. The contribution of civil society organizations as equal partners in this work is important if we're going to get somewhere. We're also going to do a report on the transposition of the directive by the end of the year, including a report on the criminalization of those who knowingly use the services of victims. I want to say here that 26 out of 27 member states have already notified the Commission of transposition of the legislation. We are very grateful that the very proactive approach of the Commission on this issue has produced timely results. Germany still has a notified transposition, and we're eager to receive that notification soon. We will publish the policy review, as already explained, with the funding, with the mapping of the funding as well. We will put the victims' fundamental rights at the forefront, even when those who don't want to recognize them as victims like to call them trafficked persons. We will continue to do that. If we don't have a victim, we don't have a perpetrator. If you don't have a perpetrator, you don't have a crime. If you don't have a crime, you basically promote impunity. And this is not something that the Commission will tolerate. And we will, of course, ensure to promote a wide and meaningful implementation of the legislation. I want to close with something that I also said to my colleagues this morning. It's easy to say, but it's also very true. There is no need for new legislation on trafficking. There is no need for a groundbreaking policy framework on trafficking. There is no need to double the budget on trafficking. We have everything in our disposals. We need to implement what the member states have promised to do, and it's their legal obligation to do that. And if we don't think of legal obligations, we should be at least thinking of the victims. And at the end of the day, these are the people we're here to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by thanking our partner, the European Union, for hosting the launch. In particular, Miria Fesialadu, thank you for inviting us here and for all your work, which you've just outlined, which is very critical to addressing the problems we face. And I would like to echo your words in saying that they are important problems and problems that we have to think about the victims. For UNODC, the EU is a key strategic partner, both in the area of policy development, but also, as this project shows, on a concrete operational level. Through the support of the EU, UNODC is able to assist countries in all regions in combating all forms of organized crime, including migrant smuggling and trafficking in persons. In fact, our migrant smuggling and human trafficking team has, since 2014, has been able to work in 60 countries and train over 1,400 officials, and that's due in large part, I think, to the support of the EU. I also would like to thank the International Organization for Migration and UNICEF for also working with us on this project, but also being here. And I do think also I'll echo the words saying that it's important for us to work together and coordinate. Now, if you allow me, I want to start my presentation on a somewhat personal note, but 100 years ago, my grandfather, Camilo, was looking for a better future, and he made a long journey to a world unfamiliar to him. He was a tough person, Camilo. I'm told you didn't want to get on his bad side. And he suffered some undue hardship during his journey, I'm also told. But he was a man with a heart, and I'm sure this tough man who never looked back, who never talked about his journey, would be shedding incredible tears today if he was around to see the suffering, the human suffering surrounding the migration and trafficking, human trafficking challenges the world faces today. First, the scope. There is no region that is not affected by trafficking in persons or migrant smuggling. On trafficking in persons alone, UNODC has identified at least 510 routing patterns worldwide, and has collected data on victims with 152 different citizenships. Likewise, in a recent UNODC assessment on smuggling of migrants in Asia, multiple trends and flows were identified extending throughout the world. The acute and multiple related challenges facing Europe at the moment only highlight the globalized nature of these crimes and their devastating impacts on our shared communities. Second, I think my grandfather would shed tears over the tragic motives for some these days in moving. Of course, my grandfather left for a better life. He did not face conflict or war or serious human rights violations. Also, he was not a victim of trafficking. And of course, with increased flows of migration, as Miria said, these are very separate things, at least legally, but there are victims of trafficking. And as the migration flows increase and become more desperate, it opens up more people being vulnerable to be trafficked and to become victims. And fourth, the tragic way of passage. The tragic way of passage, I think my grandfather would shed tears about. He bought a ticket from a legitimate transport company. For many today, their perilous journeys are organized by smugglers who profit from their endangerment and vulnerability. Those on the move are at serious risk of abuse, exploitation, and becoming trafficked at different stages in their journey. In recent months, we have been deeply touched by the harrowing images of men, women, and children who have lost their lives at sea and on land. And fourth, the fate of children. UNODC's 2014 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons confirms that children in particular are amongst the most vulnerable and increasingly most prevalent categories of trafficking victims. 1 in 3 detected victims of human trafficking globally, according to our report, are children, which marks a 5% increase compared to the 2007 to 2010 period. As the UN Secretary General has said recently, the current refugee and migration crisis is not only a defining moment for Europe, but also for the world. Shared communities, but also shared responsibility. This message has been at the core of our joint EU and UNODC response. So ladies and gentlemen, this is why today we are very pleased to launch this important new initiative, the Global Action to Prevent and Address Trafficking in Persons and the Smuggling of Migrants, in partnership with IOM and UNICEF. The four-year project aims to strengthen a comprehensive criminal justice response to trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants in strategically selected countries in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Building on years of successful joint project implementation, this new initiative actually marks the largest joint EU-UNODC project to date in financial terms on trafficking and smuggling, but also in one of the most ambitious in terms of geographical reach. In addition to providing assistance to governmental authorities, this project will also benefit civil society organizations as well as victims of trafficking and smuggled migrants directly. Some of the key areas of intervention include the development of comprehensive strategies and policies to address trafficking in persons on a national level, tailored to the country's context, technical assistance to ensure that domestic legislative frameworks are harmonized with international standards and best practices, and tailored capacity building for the full spectrum of relevant actors. There'll be a significant cross-border pillar. Commonly identified challenge, obviously, is the need for greater cooperation, both internally among different agencies within countries and civil society organizations, but also at the regional and trans-regional levels. And key to the comprehensive nature of this project is that the implementation with our partners, IOM, will work with civil society organizations to develop assistance and support programs for victims of trafficking and vulnerable migrants. And UNICEF will work with victim support services and relevant government authorities to develop frameworks for protection and assistance of children. Clearly, the engagement of member states will be a critical factor in the success of this project. I think my grandfather would be proud of what we're trying to do today. So working together with our national counterparts, the EU delegations and counterparts at DevCo, our implementing partners, IOM and UNICEF, as well as drawing on UNODC's field and regional level presence, we hope to seize upon opportunities to tighten our collective response to these crimes. We look forward to meeting again in the future to regain our dialogue and commitment and joint progress. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon to all, and thank you, first of all, to the organizers for putting together this launch and for inviting us to be part of it. Is a pleasure and is an honor for me to share this panel with a lot of friends and colleagues, some new acquaintances, with whom we worked on a lot of issues and a lot of aspects of migration governance, including what we are discussing here today, countering trafficking and smuggling. And to you too, Mira, sorry for hearing again some of the issues that you already heard this morning in the other meeting on the same subject. We were together. Let me start by thanking the EU, the Commission, DevCo, Stefano and your staff, as well as, of course, media for their continued leadership, commitment, and engagement to improve and better migration governance in general, as well as, of course, ensuring more effective protection for migrants in need is also particularly important for us, and I'm particularly happy to be here alongside UNODC and UNICEF, who are our long-standing partner in many of the action we carry out around the world, and that are also our partner for this global action to prevent and address trafficking in person and the smuggling of migrants. I will not bore you for too long of a time. I would just like to touch upon two small aspects, one related to our role in this global action that is launched here today, and also offer a couple of reflections on some of the critical issues that we think are affecting the anti-trafficking and anti-smuggling response, and that points to the challenges that we have in front of us and that needs to be tackled in the course of the implementation of the program that we are launching today. To the implementation of its program and project, IOM has assisted so far over 75,000 trafficked victims. I had persons written here, but I changed it to victims because you convinced me, Mira, that that's the word that needs to be used. So 75,000 trafficked victims and exploited migrants since 1997, and we are currently implementing migrants assistance projects and programs all around the world in every region that is touched by the phenomenon. Our approach is based on three main principles that govern all of our protection and assistance work. The first is respect for human rights. The second is ensuring physical, mental, and social well-being of the individual as well as their community of origin. And the third is the sustainability of the action through institutional capacity building of government, civil society, and other actors, as well as the facilitation of durable solutions for all beneficiaries. Given its long-standing experience working with government and civil society organizations to uphold the human rights of migrants, IOM in this global action will be implementing activities related to the development and implementation of protection and assistance frameworks that uphold the rights of trafficked victims, smuggled migrants, and other vulnerable migrants in the project's beneficiary countries. In particular, we will be providing technical assistance, including capacity building and training to governments, authorities, civil society organizations on the human rights of migrants, as well as identification, referral, and protection of trafficked victims, smuggled migrants, and other migrants in vulnerable situations. We will be updating and developing global guidance and training material on best practice standards, systems, mechanisms, and tools to effectively protect migrant needs. We'll be supporting the strengthening of the capacity of the government and civil society organization to provide quality assistance and protection services to vulnerable migrants in line with international standards. And we will also be disbursing small grants through civil society organizations for the provision of assistance and integration services to trafficking victims, smuggled migrants, and other vulnerable migrants. Now, countering trafficking and smuggling is, of course, one of the main issues that we are facing and tackling in Europe since a long time, but with increased attention since the increase in the migratory pressure that Europe has been witnessing in the last year, starting already in 2014. And if we look at what is the current response in Europe to these migratory challenges and migratory pressure, I think we will be pointed towards identifying some of the key challenges that we will have to meet in the implementation of this program if we want to ensure the upholding of the rights of migrants, including the victims of trafficking. The Syria crisis has created an unprecedented level of displacement in the region around Syria, but also towards Europe. So far, over 1 million people have reached our continent through sea, through land route, and through any other means available to them. I wish that when we discuss and think about how we should handle the current migratory flow to Europe, the history of your grandfather be heard a bit more and remembered a bit more, because sometimes we forget that what we are trying to handle today is what many in our family a few years ago have already gone through and had the luck of receiving a certain welcoming and a certain assistance that allowed them to actually reach the dream that set them in motion to begin with. Many of the people that are reaching Europe are fleeing war, persecution, but are also fleeing extreme poverty or long-term displacement and staying in refugee or other displaced camps with limited or no livelihood opportunities at all. Over 1 million have made it to Europe. Several thousands didn't have the same luck and died during the journey in the Mediterranean or on land route. All those who made it to Europe are all too frequently ending up in the clutches of smugglers or of traffickers. By the very nature, the migratory flows that are coming to us are mixed. Many other regions and countries across the world are impacted by mixed migratory flows. The Horn of Africa, the Gulf of Aden, Bay of Bengal, the Greater Mekong region, just to mention a few. And many of those that are on the move defy easy categorization and are not necessarily covered by the 1951 Convention, and yet they are vulnerable groups, also in need of some form of protection and assistance. You are a victim of trafficking, exploitation, abuse. You have families with children. You have unaccompanied children. You have children that have become separated along the route and lost their family. You have single women, pregnant women, elderly, sick. A variety of categories that are not so easily legally identified as in need of protection, but they still require our assistance and our protection. We've made in Europe considerable progress in creating legal framework that better protects those identified as victims of trafficking. In many countries, registered victims now have access to temporary assistance, safe accommodation, medical and psychological support, as well as assistant voluntary return and reintegration opportunities if they so wish. A few have even been provided compensation for the ordeal they have been going through. But we have to admit that the numbers of people benefiting from all this form of assistance and protection remain small compared to the magnitude of the phenomenon we are trying to fight. Also, the line that separates smuggled migrants and victims of traffic or for many other exploited or abused migrants is blurred at best. It is very clear in the legal provision and in the convention, but in the reality and in the reaction that very often government have towards this issue is not so clearly defined. All of us, government, NGO, international organizations that are in the field working on this issue and are confronted with the real people and their story, is sometimes difficult to make clear distinction. A migrant that is irregularly entering Europe and working in the black market might not automatically or easily be recognized as a victim of trafficking and exploitation, and yet it is a victim of those users of these services that was mentioned by media before. We are confronting a situation that has no quick nor easy solution, but we definitely need a greater commitment by all to protecting the human rights of all migrants, and I think this is a precondition for any successful program and any successful action that we try to put in place. We are happy to be able to join forces with the EU, the Commission, with UNODC and with UNICEF under this global action to help promote and effectively advance the human rights of migrants. We are convinced this will make a difference in the result we are achieving to protect the victims of trafficking and of all sorts of exploitation. And we look very much forward to commencing the activities of this global action with our partner. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure but also a challenge to come after a series of partners who have already said many of the things that you were probably expecting to hear on the one hand, but also that I had planned to say. But let me maybe then sort of try something inspired by Miriam's statement and also by John's story of his grandfather. Let me just sort of pull back the time and imagine we were sort of 2,000 years earlier. What would we have called that young girl that has become known as Europa at the time when she was taken and lured onto the back of Zeus, transformed in the shape of a bull, and taken to a Greek island across the East Mediterranean Sea? Would she be referred to as smuggled, as trafficked? What would Zeus be referred to today? And I think this is just a reminder of how important I think it is that here in Europe and with the lead of the European Commission, we are doing everything we can to prevent crimes that create victims and to prevent crimes where the motive is primarily profits and where the victim's interests, best interests and concerns is the least of any concern. So in this, starting with this, it's clear also that what this global action aims to do and what we all hope to do is to act on the recognition that business as usual is hard to sustain at the times that we're in terms of the magnitude, the scale, the scope of the crisis. And in that regard, we have also, I think, come an incredibly long way. And I would like to thank here in particular the incredible leadership of Miriam and her team, who has helped to push along a paradigm shift that we have seen as UNICEF here at the European Union level, along with, of course, a lot of other partners. In the MDG framework, so the Millennium Development Goals, the issues of ending violence against children, preventing abuse, exploitation, were almost nowhere. They were not addressed. The push of many, many actors has now put the prevention of violence, exploitation, abuse into and firmly into the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. We have in the European Union also learned together, and thanks to the provision in the Anti-Trafficking Action Plan inspired by the directive, we have learned together that an issue-by-issue approach where we are looking at specific and different groups of vulnerable children, whether they are abused, whether they're abused at home, in institutions, whether they become victims of trafficking, whether they live in abject poverty, whether they experience the violence at schools or at home. We have learned that an issue-by-issue approach is not only ineffective, it doesn't work. So we need to embed any response to prevent trafficking, to respond to trafficking, to protect children against all forms of violence as part of an approach that goes wider, that looks at the entire system. And the push that has come from the anti-trafficking strategy, which takes a comprehensive approach, has helped to also then create the 10 guiding principles that the European Commission has adopted and presented last year on how we can together create child protection systems that are integrated and that are able to serve and identify all victims, all children at different stages on their path. And we have also come a long way together in making this also be reflected in the Human Rights Action Plan that EIS has just adopted, that is now guiding the next 5 years, human rights action, the EU's external policy, the communications and conversations the EU will have externally with other countries, where again also for the first time strengthening national child protection systems is an explicit priority of EU foreign action. So if we look back 5 years ago and where we are here today, I think we can all in some way feel that the many partners, the many interactions, the many conversations, the many efforts have made a difference. But now, of course, as you said, we have a framework, we have a policy, we have an understanding of what needs to be done, but the action is needed, the results are needed. And all of you have already identified the incredible challenges and the large number of children among the victims of trafficking. And also now, as we are seeing more and more every day when you open your TV at night or your smartphone, among those who are victims of, in many cases, exploitative forms of being smuggled, being trafficked, arriving in the European Union. The first victim this year of what we so easily refer to as a refugee and migrant crisis was a 2-year-old boy, washed up again on the shores and on the 2nd of January. But there were many before him, and there will be many more after him again. We have estimated together with IOM that more than 1/4 of all the deaths at sea have been children. We know globally that children make an incredibly large number, a third, depending on what numbers you look, that up to a third of victims not only detected but among those who are being trafficked. We know that we're talking about millions of children who are affected. And probably this is only the tip of the iceberg, because we don't see the full scale and scope of those children who are in situations that we seek to address. So we have the framework. We are, I think, all woken up by the refugee and migrant crisis on the urgency to act, the urgency to implement. But now progress will not just happen in itself. We need the political will to sustain beyond the European migrant and refugee crisis, because it is a global phenomenon. We need the investments, and we need to then use the right policies. Now, what have we then learned, and what is now the opportunity, and what is this global action able to contribute? And what UNICEF wants to do also with the part that we aim to focus on. We need to build those systems now that can prevent children from becoming victims in the first place, that can help identify the vulnerabilities and the factors that make children an easy prey of those who want to exploit them. We need to build the systems that can help respond to those children, that can help reintegrate them, that can help make their lives become normal, if that is possible at all, after the ordeals many of them had experienced. So when we're talking about building child protection systems, many of us often step back and think, okay, yes, we agree, but really, what do you talk about? Really, what do you want us to do? So we've learned we shouldn't have these individual issue-by-issue approaches, so now we do systems, but then you start scratching on the surface, and many of us will probably step back and say, so what now? So what is it? And just to sort of maybe reiterate, when we say child protection systems, we mean all the pieces together. So it's the laws, it's the policies, it's the protocols, it's the referral systems that actually interact and integrate to keep children safe, to support, prevent violence, abuse, exploitation, including trafficking. We need those systems to work effectively for all children, because we have learned that children move from different categories on the slippery slope often that ends up to children becoming victims of trafficking. They may live in abject poverty. They may live in a violent household. They may live in an area where no services are available. They may have other special needs that need to be attended. They may then decide to leave. They may end up in an institution. They may go missing from an institution because they're fleeing violence, exploitation there. They may decide, or they may have to flee their country. They may be smuggled. They may be trafficked. They may then be identified, or they may never be identified. And depending at what moment in time a child is identified, we give them a different label. But actually the systems would have had to work all along the journey, and then the child would never have become a victim in the first place. So we know systems how they work in health. We understand that a health system, consists of hospitals and doctors and managers and laws and budgets. We know how systems work in the transport field. We understand there are policies, regulations. So child protection systems are actually just extending the same approach to bring together the actors that we need, the policies, the frameworks, the institutions, so the justice, the education, the health piece, the lawyers, the practitioners, the families, the social workers. And together, as they work together, they make up an effective child protection system. Now, the global action itself will again still be, I think we have to be honest, a drop in a very, very big ocean as to the challenge and the scope. But what we hope to achieve together is strengthen systems in a number of critical countries that can keep all children safer and that can help those victims that have been identified reintegrate and get the assistance, support, and help they need. Now, children that become victims of trafficking, they need a legal system that responds to them. They need prosecutions to work. They need social support, psychosocial support. They need families. They need reintegration support. They need a long-term perspective. So all of this is required. So we need to build frameworks and protocols and coordination mechanisms that can help those children along and prevent children becoming victims in the first place. Now, what UNICEF aims to do as part of the global action, in partnership with UNODC, with IOM, and with many other actors, national authorities, local authorities, social workers, civil society, is to assist a number of countries to develop frameworks for protection and assistance of children among trafficked victims and smuggled migrants within child protection systems. So by strengthening the systems, but by focusing specifically on victims, we want to actually make the systems work better and help the individuals concerned. Now, violence, we know, is preventable. Child trafficking is also preventable. And as you have said, it's a profit motive that drives it. So it is not that we should, in the scale of the challenge, sit back and just think, well, it's global, it's there, it's always been there. No, it is preventable. And it is not inevitable. No child should live in fear, and no child should become a victim of trafficking. And our lesson, of course, is now that if we take that partnership approach, and that is why I think that global action is so important, because it brings us even closer together. It forces us that we have to think harder how we can become more integrated and more coherent in our internal external action on the EU side, in the different approaches from UNODC side, IOM, UNICEF, how we can take a comprehensive view that really looks at children, women, mothers, or as a child transits from being a small girl to a teenager to a mother and a woman later. So we need to work together even closer because partnerships are key. So our lessons that we've learned to take an integrated systems approach, to work in partnerships, we can now try to take to action with the global action and with the extended partnership of the European Union, because only then will we actually really be able to make prevention and protection of children both actionable, measurable, and sustainable. So in this, I'm looking forward to the 4-year venture that we're entering in together, and I hope that in 4 years from now, we can feel that as much of the lessons we have so far learned will have been implemented, and that we will have an even better understanding of what it takes to eradicate a crime that is a crime against people, that creates victims and that is driven by profits, but that in the discussion we don't lose sight of the numbers of children that are concerned who, for no fault of their own, become victims and require our absolute and utmost attention. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, first of all, I wish to thank you, the 4 speakers. I think it was an extremely rich and interesting debate. We have roughly 20 minutes. Therefore, I think that we have a bit of the time for question and answer, but I would really think we cannot go beyond 2:30 because we all have to go back to our occupations. So I think that there must be another micro, right? That's okay. So if you can just, okay, we have a question here, the second row. And if you can also indicate to whom your question is addressed. Yes.
Coach Geisler, team of external speakers of the European Commission, it was fascinating to listen to you. Commissioner Avramopoulos has announced that in 4 weeks his expectation is that the hotspots in Greece and in Italy will work much more in a much more effective way than they do right now. Can I ask perhaps Mirja, what is your expectation if this becomes true as far as the effect on trafficking is concerned? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we...
It's a very hard question, and it's an easy question. It's a very hard question because of all the challenges that we're faced with in relation to ensuring the implementation of what we have promised to do. But it's an easy question because when it comes to trafficking, we have everything in place when it comes to the guidelines for identification of victims. We know we have targeted guidelines for different kinds of officials, ranging from border guards to consular services to migration officers. We have a law that we should be implementing. What I said before still stands. We know what we need to do. The member states know what needs to be done in relation to trafficking I'm referring to. We have everything in place. We have the know-how. The question is the extent to which everything we have promised to do will be implemented. And for that, it's up to the individual actors to do so.
Okay. Any other question?
Well, I was wondering, we haven't heard much about the third countries. If I could please be enlightened on how were these countries selected, these countries that you've selected from Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, and what level of commitment do we have from these countries, so to speak, at the moment? We don't know.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Elias Kaldis. I'm the head of the Human Trafficking and Smuggling section. I'm working for John. And we'll be implementing the project. Margaret Okolo is the project coordinator, so she's here. So there were a number of criteria for the selection of the partner countries. I need to say that the UNODC operates only in countries that ask for help and only at the request and with the agreement of the country. So that's one important factor. The second factor is political commitment and ongoing cooperation. The third factor is what we see as current needs and trends. And of course, the specific plan for each of the countries will be discussed with the specific governments, and there will be an ongoing consultation process that will start in the next couple of weeks with the specific countries in question. But also, I need also to stress the fact that the project has also a much larger regional and trans-regional scope, so we expect that these countries will also work with other countries, and this is an important part of the project as well. So.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Colin Cogito and I work for the European Peace Building Liaison Office. And I was really glad to hear that the root causes of migration were addressed in your presentation. Probably conflict and human rights violations are among the top priorities. And my question, we're referring to the financing of this project. I was wondering whether it was financed by the ICSP instrument from the EU. And the second question was whether there were synergies with the cocaine route program that the EU is also implementing on several of the countries that are mentioned in the presentation of the project.
Well, I can easily reply to the first question. The funding of the project is being secured with the migration budget line of the development cooperation instruments. Therefore, the budget line that we implement in my unit, that could be 3. For the coordination, yes, we are, let's say, liaising with our colleagues in other units dealing with projects which have interaction, interlinkages with the issues we are talking about, namely, for instance, that could be 5. Eddie Meyer, I think, was there, perhaps is no longer there, but certainly we can elaborate further on the different links and colleagues in FBI and so on. We know, I mean, there are a lot of projects that have to do with these issues, but we have coordination tracks which work very well. We exchange information. We have also to thank a lot, I have to say, Miriam's team for this effort of gathering together all the information, so we have a very clear picture of what we are collectively doing. So, yeah, that is my reply. Any other question? Yes, last.
Thank you. I'm Christine Hedström from Child Fund, and I want to thank all the speakers for excellent presentations and certainly a clear recognition for the importance of child protection systems and in whatever vulnerable situation children may find themselves. And my question was just related to the project in terms of rollout and planning. When would we perhaps know the countries and how it will go ahead, and also to express I think willingness from many civil society organizations to also provide insights or whatever we would know of a given situation or area in a given country, to sort of plea for a good dialogue with the civil society in those countries where it will be carried out. Thank you.
Perhaps colleagues from... Yes, Michael, you're in the
Well, we have the list of countries, so we can discuss that. But we're actually, our plan is to start in the next few weeks the outreach and starting the process of kind of determining how we're going to do the initial assessment phase. But I'll turn it over to Margaret, who will be the project coordinator, who can give you more detail on exactly what steps we have planned at the moment.
Thank you, John. I'm Margaret Akulo, and I'll be coordinating the project together with our partners in IOM and UNICEF. We distributed a short fact sheet, and the list of countries that we would be working with is actually listed there. But in terms of moving forward, Ilyas mentioned sort of the consultation process in terms of the countries that were selected. So we've actually started an engagement process. For the next 6 months, we're going to be working at various levels. First with our partners, IOM and UNICEF, also with the EU, but also with the countries who would be receiving assistance and working with us. We're going to start a needs assessment and gaps assessment in the countries identified. We have a network of field offices, not just UNODC, but IOM and UNICEF. So we've been working together, and I think the key, which came out of all the speakers, was the cooperation at different levels. So we will be engaging with counterparts from the countries. We've started discussions with the permanent missions, some of whom I believe are in the audience today, and we will be looking for guidance and information from the countries themselves in terms of what their priority needs are. That would guide the process. We're looking at this for the first 6 months of this year and hope to actually come with a work plan, an action plan in terms of what would be delivered in each of the countries, contextualized to the country context. So that's the plan for the first 6 months. We'll carry out the assessments. It's a global project. It's complex, but we believe we've got a good framework, a good structure for engagement and delivery.
Okay, thank you. I think it was useful and clear. Any other question? So if it is not the case, I think that we can close. Thank you very much for the big attendance and attention from all of you. So, thank you.